Okay, guys, one game. Let's try to make it count. 1478, trying to hit 1500. Let's see what we get this time. All right, we've got black against Radio Galaxy, 1441. And mostly we have been getting 1e4. We actually have not gotten a single 1d4 just yet, and that remains the case. We continue exploring the depths of the Sicilian, and we still have not gotten a mainline accelerated dragon either. Okay, this seems pretty promising. We go knight c6, and let's hope we see d4. This will be our first. Nope, we are still getting bishop c4 essentially every game, which I think is really interesting because it shows you that people just don't really study the Sicilian really up through like 1600, which is pretty eye-opening to me because I don't remember this being the case in our first speedrun. So maybe we're just getting unlucky or lucky depending on how you think about it, because bishop c4 is not a very good move. Now, a couple of videos ago, I gave you a pretty detailed rundown of exactly how to meet the bishop c4 system. Of course, we also faced it, but we also talked about the quote-unquote main lines of bishop c4. And the first step here is to blunt the bishop with the classic move e6. And e6 is a move that should be logical to you without really any prior knowledge, right? You're creating a classic situation where the bishop is biting on granite. And of course, you're also preparing d7, d5, which is a very useful move in many of these positions to grab control of the center and hit the bishop. So most of the time, white castles, right? We mostly examined castles, and then you might remember that the move there is knight g8 to f6. And in that position, we looked at a bunch of different moves. Our opponent is taking their time. Let's see what white comes up with here. I mean, apart from castling, white has a bunch of other moves, and all of them are kind of the same, right? It's not like the difference between d3 and knight c3 and castles isn't all that large. Knight c3. Okay, so our opponent continues to develop, and we should continue to do the same. You should remember one important detail, that knight f6 in this line can be safely played without fearing e5. I think a lot of players, they look at knight f6 and they say, well, I can't do that because of e5. And you end up playing a slightly more passive move here like d6. Now, d6 is okay, but of course we want to be able to play d5 in one fell swoop in these positions. So you should remember from our analysis that knight f6, e5 is not scary for several different reasons. As Nifa points out, e5 can be met, first of all, with the typical move d5. You also see that in the Scotch Gambit, this idea of meeting e5 with d5, and that counterattacks the bishop on c4. That's one way to meet it. Another way to meet e5 is just to jump with the knight to g4. And that hits the pawn on e5, forces white to defend it with queen e2, and then we can remove the pawn from the board, either by playing queen c7 and trying to win the pawn, or more to the point would be to play a move like d6 in that position to force the exchange and help us develop our pieces. But all of that is a moot point because white plays d3. And now we reap the benefits of not pushing d6 prematurely. In this position, it makes perfect sense, I think, to push d5 straight away and get more control of the center and essentially solve all of our opening problems in one move. So I think already after d5, I would probably prefer black here. The position, of course, is equal. Objectively, according to the engine, it always evaluates the positions in this line as just like zeros. But we can already fight for the advantage because we have a larger share of the center. So already an instructive moment after bishop b5 because we have a pretty vast choice. We have a choice between playing d4, d takes e4, which is a pretty tempting move to me because it forces an endgame in which, after the trade of queens, white is essentially going to be forced to move their king. Okay? Now, you might be tempted by d4 for the wrong reason. You might notice that after d4, knight e2, we have queen a5 check winning the bishop. Unfortunately, after d4, we cannot rely on our opponent making a blunder, even if it's likely. The problem is that after d4, white can first take the knight on c6. This also has the byproduct of ruining our pawn structure. And after bc, white drops the knight back to e2. So I don't like d4 at all. I feel like closing the center here, it generally benefits the player who has less space or less control over the center, and that's definitely not us. So I like two different approaches here. I like d takes e4. I think that's a good move. And I think the resulting endgame can only be slightly better for black. I also like a typical developing move like bishop e7. Absolutely nothing wrong here with just playing bishop e7 and castles. You don't need to play a6, right? There's no need to force this bishop to take the knight, because he actually might do that anyway if we just continue developing our pieces. So we're choosing between forcing an endgame with pawn takes pawn or just continuing our development with bishop e7. I feel like the Russian schoolboy approach would be to take the pawn, but trading queens this early in the game, a little bit toothless. I want us to have a fun game, so let's go with bishop e7. And I'll talk a little bit about the endgame afterward. Knight e5, our opponent is pouncing on us with knight e5. Now, this is not a scary move because white does not have the horsepower to sustain an attack against the c6 knight, which we have many different ways to defend. Now, you shouldn't panic here and go bishop d7 because that would give up the bishop pair, and I don't want to give up the bishop pair. There's no need for that. A more strategic way to defend the knight would be to play the move queen to c7. And then you might be afraid of bishop f4 in response, but bishop f4 in response is similarly not scary because we can shift the bishop from e7 to d6 to unpin our queen. And in that resulting position, interesting things actually start happening. And I'm just trying to calculate a funny line that occurs in the resulting position. Yeah, let's do it. Let's go queen c7. Let's see if we can actually get that line on the board, because I think bishop f4 is going to follow pretty quickly. An alternative, by the way, something that I would maybe even play in a classical game is just queen to b6, right? Queen to b6 is a good alternative because it protects the knight and it's not in the way of any of white's pieces, right? Knight a4 in that resulting position would blunder the bishop on b5. Queen f3. I believe that blunders a knight in one move. Now, my only reservation is that white has bishop f4 in that position, but our queen is not trapped. Our queen, in fact, has two different distinct evacuation routes. The easy move is queen to h5, just essentially offering a queen trade. But even queen e5 to d4, I think, is quite safe because the queen can then evacuate to b4. And everything is groovy. So I don't see a reason not to take the knight. I think that was just a flat-out blunder. And, okay, I'd hesitate to say that the game is over. Some people, they just resign when they blunder like this. But at this level, I think most people are going to continue playing. Now, I actually think we have a very clinical way to play this. I think we have a cute way to get out of white's initiative. Now, watch this. Okay, queen h5 is, of course, totally possible. What happens after queen h5? Well, one possibility for white in response is to trade queens and then play pawn takes pawn on d5. And if you're visualizing that resulting position, you might notice that the bishop on f4 is actually hanging and we can capture it. But then unpleasant things start to happen. White takes on c6 with the pawn and has an x-ray. And white's managed to garner a pawn for the piece, which is something we shouldn't allow if we can help it. So queen h5 leads to these complications. So is there an intermezzo? Intermezzo, the name of one of the best restaurants in Charlotte, but also, if you ever find yourself here, also the name of what we are about to do. An intermezzo is an in-between move, also known as a Zwischenzug, and it's a move you throw in before the quote-unquote main move you're trying to make, right? So the main move here is to move the queen away. So before we move the queen away, we start by playing the simple d takes e4. And you always have to be very careful when you're playing with a hanging queen. It doesn't even matter what you're doing. You always need to double check that, for example, in such positions where both queens are hanging, you should absolutely make sure that your opponent doesn't have a way to move their queen with check, which would then leave your queen hanging, and b, a desperado sacrifice where, let's say that there was a rook on g4 here, right? For the purpose of argument, white would have queen takes rook. Since white is going to give up the queen anyway, the logic is that you give it up for as much value as you can. And desperado sacks can be easy to miss, and they can be game changers. Of course, here, neither thing is possible. White does have a check, bishop takes c6 check, but that doesn't change anything after bc. Okay, now if white plays knight takes e4, yeah, then queen takes b2, wins another pawn. I mean, it gets a little bit complicated. I think we should meet knight takes e4 just with queen to d5. in order to intercept white's queen, okay? Because if you calculate knight takes e4, queen takes b2, there's actually this nasty idea bishop takes knight check, and then the knight takes the knight with check, and then the queen would be able to capture on c6. Things get kind of complicated there, and when you're up a piece, you want to avoid unnecessary complication. Queen e5 to h5, and now, of course, there is no further complexities here. Everything is clarified, and we are simply up a piece. But that doesn't mean you should fall asleep or that the rest of the game is going to be lame. We still need to convert it, and there's still plenty for us to learn and practice. So the next step, assuming that our opponent doesn't go for the queen trade. If white goes for the queen trade, everything is really quite straightforward. If white keeps the queens on the board with a move like, I'm anticipating queen g3, then our next step is to complete our development. We still need to castle. We still need to eventually figure out a home for the c8 bishop, which is currently hemmed in by the e6 pawn. Notice that after you castle kingside, you're going to have the possibility of jumping into d4 with the c6 knight, which I think is a really good possibility, something to keep in mind. Other than that, everything here is going to be very straightforward. We're going to complete our development, try to get this bishop out of the gates, and once we do that, we're either going to continue simplifying and continue insisting on the queen trade, or we're going to launch a direct attack on white's center or on white's king using our extra piece. And that's that. And our opponent continues to think. Yeah, but it's interesting, since our opponent is thinking, we can use this time for some philosophical discussions. It is surprising me that so many people are choosing bishop c4 against the Sicilian, because the Sicilian really should be one of the first things that you learn when you're building an opening repertoire. And that's why I'm so insistent on the c3 Sicilian, because I think it's an easy, compact opening that can be learned in a few days. And it's just ridiculously dangerous, because people who learn the Sicilian with black, they often only learn the open Sicilian, especially at the lower levels, and they really have no idea what to do against the Alpen, as we've seen. Queen d3. Okay, well, that's just another way of keeping the queens on the board. And in response, we castle short. And of course, queen d3 is a pretty awkward square, because it's also walking into rook to d8, which is a nice move to throw in with tempo. Just hitting the queen. We don't have to do it on the next move, just making these mental notes to myself. And another thing I'm noticing is that we could push the pawn up to e5 and open up the light square bishop. So that would be one way to deploy the bishop, play e5, and then, for example, go bishop to e6. Okay, bishop takes e6, bc. Now, you might be like, well, why didn't I avoid this? Why didn't we go bishop to d7 here? Well, the answer is that I don't give a damn about this pawn structure. We are up a piece. This pawn structure is visually ugly, that is true, but it's actually not that bad. c5 is well protected. c6 is hard to access. In fact, the pawn on c6 is controlling some important squares, as is the pawn on c5. And yeah, the pawn on a7 is isolated, but none of it can be attacked. And all of it is, you have to always have the hierarchy of importance in mind. When you're up a piece, you can afford to take certain liberties. If material was equal, then we would assign more weight to this particular factor. But right now, everything pales in comparison to the fact that you're just up a full piece. You don't really care about anything else. Okay, so let's get the bishop out of c8. I see two ways of trying to do that. We can also play a5 and do it on the other side. a5 and bishop to a6. An idea worth remembering that occurs in many different openings. But I feel like a6 is kind of a dead end. Wow, and Ivan, you literally said, is a5 a good move here at precisely the moment that I said it, which is kind of funny. The reason I don't like a5 that much is because even after we get the bishop to a6, the rook's going to move out of the way, and the bishop is just going to be shooting into thin air a little bit, right? I want the bishop to be more centrally located, and so my choice is e5. And also this move comes with tempo, which is always a nice bonus. And then we deploy the light squared bishop to e6. Now, of course, once the bishop moves away from c8, and this is something that should be spinning in your head at all times. Anytime a piece moves from a particular square, you have to reassess whether your opponent can now access certain squares with their pieces, right? So for example, after the bishop moves away from c8, white's queen can jump into a6, something that you should be aware of. But queen a6 can be simply met with rook f8 to c8. And yeah, a little bit passive on the queen side, but the queen's not going to stay on a6 forever. We're going to smoke it out eventually. Another thing I'm noticing is that after e5, our queen is kind of a little bit stuck on the king side, which is not a bad place to be stuck on. But nonetheless, perhaps a little bit later in the game, we'll try to find a way to get this queen on a square where it controls the center more directly. Yeah, Horsey asks, isn't c5 vulnerable after bishop e3? So again, it is, but what's the worst case scenario? You lose a pawn. Big deal, right? You're up a piece. But after bishop e3, we have a very concrete move that takes this bishop off the board, right? The queen is aiming at h2, so you should see the move knight g4. And that's probably also how our opponent was thinking. Knight g4 threatens mate, forces h3, and we can trade very favorably the knight for the bishop, getting ourselves, by the way, a nice little bishop pair on top of everything else. Now, this is where you get into the area of refinement, right? Constantly refining your ideas, finding the best execution for everything. So rather than playing knight g4 immediately, knight g4 is a 1900 level move. But what's the 2300 level move? Well, the 2300 approach is to understand that knight g4 isn't going anywhere. So what we can do is throw in a very valuable tempo move. It's a move that I've mentioned previously. We've made a mental note to ourselves to look for this move. And now it's time for this move. And the move is rook d8. Now, it's not because it attacks the queen that this move is so effective. The reason this is effective is because the queen is almost out of squares. If it goes back to e2, then thank you for the queen trade, and then thank you for the center pawn. And if it goes to c4, now the move knight g4 is 100 times more effective, because after h3, we take the bishop on e3, and white has to make this ridiculously ugly recapture with the pawn, totally ruining white's kingside, and the win is going to follow shortly thereafter. That's precisely what's going to happen. Knight g4, forcing h3, and after knight takes e3, with the queen on d3, white would have been able to preserve the integrity of his structure by taking back with the queen. Now this is impossible. White has to take back with a pawn, and that opens up all sorts of avenues for our pieces. Even the move rook to d2 in the resulting position looks mighty good. But I think we're going to throw in bishop e6 first. So we could have, yeah, of course, we could have also played bishop e6 here as well. I'm just reversing the order. It really doesn't matter. Bishop e6, knight g4, tomato, tomato. We're playing knight g4 first and then taking... But don't go bishop e6 here. Don't get too fancy. Because if you play bishop e6 here, white can actually take the knight. And you might say, oh, but in the resulting exchanges, we take the rook on f1. Yeah, but you still lose material. You go from being a piece up to being only an exchange up, which is a rook for a piece. That's an absurd exchange. You shouldn't do that. Take the bishop first. And now white is aiming at f7, which is a little bit annoying. What's also annoying is that we haven't completed our development still. Let's do that now with bishop e6. High reward, low risk move. Now our pieces are finally out and we can proceed to the final stage, which is essentially now converting our extra piece into something tangible. And when I say something tangible, normally what I mean, as I said before, is either we force a favorable exchange of queens, making the extra piece easier to convert, or, okay, that's going to actually be what's happening. If the queen had moved to a4, we would have gone for checkmate with rook d2, and we would have achieved checkmate there pretty quickly. I'll show you after the game. Of course, now, if we wanted to keep the queens on the board, if you were itching to play for attack, you should go queen g6. But why would we do that? We have a very nice queen trade, and if you look a little bit deeper, we can follow this queen trade up with an even more powerful move. What am I talking about? And I know some of you are probably going to say bishop c4. A good move, but not the best move. Bishop c4, there's rook f2. And if you go bishop h4 in that position, white can block with g3. So you can't win a second piece here. Instead, what you can do is win another pawn and infiltrate the second rank with a rook d2. And this is where I think our opponent is likely to resign because we're just starting to win everything. Yeah, rook d2. I mean, bishop g5 also was a decent move, but then the king would have slid up to defend the pawn. So we can't really win e3 just yet. But bishop g5 is something that we should keep in mind as a way of attacking another weakness. This is just totally nasty. So for example, white is... Okay, knight c3, never mind. I was going to say that in response to rook f2, we would have played bishop g5. But knight c3. Well, I guess our opponent's idea is to meet rook takes c2 with rook to f2. But I'm more than happy to trade rooks, right? We're continuing to trade and continuing to take free pawns. The conversion here is really straightforward. And if white plays, let's say, rook a to b1, then we can still bring our other rook into the game with rook d8 or even rook b8. And, okay, the white's position just collapses on all seams, falls apart everywhere. And we have a nice trick here. The reason I like the move rook to b8 is because we're setting a vicious trap on top of attacking b2. After rook b8, I think our opponent will be very likely to play rook f2. And notice that the rook on b8 aligns the rooks, which always means tactics. Rook f2, rook takes c3. And because white's rooks are now disjointed, that move works. So this is something I talked about earlier, incorporating tricks into your play, making moves that are good anyway, but those moves also happen to set traps, right? That's the best way to be tricky, right? You're not making a move specifically because it sets a trap. You really only should do that in a lost position when there's no hope. Here, this is a good move on its own because it attacks b2. And once b2 is captured, we're going to have these c-pawns are going to turn into passed pawns. But also it happens to carry a trap, which our opponent falls into. There we go. And that's a second piece. Yep. We read him like a book. Like an open book. That was cool. That was a cool moment. Rook takes c3. Very simple, but this should finally tip him over, I think, toward resignation. And still we're in the realm where a lot of games are decided, unfortunately, by one-move blunders. I mean, this is unfortunate because it doesn't give us a chance to showcase certain principles, but we will get there. I mean, we're only 1478. There's like hundreds of points ahead of us. And I think when we hit like high 1500s, low 1600s, we're going to get a lot more games where, our opponents basically don't blunder all game long. We've already had a couple of those games. Okay, let's finish the job in style. Essentially, when you're up this much material, I've already said this before, the actual simplest approach normally is going to be to take a pawn and promote to a queen. Don't play for mate with your bishops. Just choose a pawn to take it, and then promote the corresponding pawn. So the two possible moves here are rook to a1 and rook to c1, and both of them do the exact same thing. We're going to play rook to c1 because this pawn is already further advanced. Notice that if white plays rook to b2, which I think our opponent is very likely to play, we actually don't even need to react. We can just play rook takes pawn, and we can cover rook b8 with bishop to f8. There we go. Just, of course, something that we had to double. And if you had been worried, you should have played g6 or something, which was also totally fine. This is not a mate. Rook b7. Okay, don't go king f8, because then rook b8 check actually forces you to give up a bishop. Do we care about this pawn? No. Just go back. And don't go bishop g5. That gets mated. Okay, so if I was really, and now we push our pawn. If I was trying to be super clinical, I would recommend most players to make Luft, right? So maybe even before playing rook c1, you play g6 or h5, just so that you don't have to worry about it, especially in the context of a time scramble. Now, what's the most clinical move here? White wants to take on c6 and delay the progress of our c-pawn. And this is the great thing about doubled pawns in endgames. When both of the pawns are passed, what you can do is use one of them as a shield for the other. This is a well-known endgame principle. I talked about this in my pawn endgame videos, where you use the back pawn as a shield, preventing, let's say, an opponent's piece from catching it. Now we get our own rook behind the pawn. Of course, we need to prevent its progress, and we are finally ready to play c3. Simple, straightforward technique. Of course, technically, white can get his rook behind the pawn, but that's not going to last very long. We're just going to use one of our bishops to attack the rook wherever it is and keep pushing it back. Yeah, this is an umbrella kind of construction. Of course, we have a great luxury that we have an extra bishop whose only role is protecting the pawn on c5. The pawn on c4 really getting like the absolute VIP treatment. And if you want like a VIP move here, we have an even better move. Well, no. Oh yeah, well we do. We have a better move than c3. What is it? Like if you really want to shut down all avenues of counterplay, you want to play like a GM, what's the move that you play here? Rook a3 to b3. We don't let our opponent infiltrate, or infiltrate's the wrong word, it's the reverse, get back to the first rank, I should say. And of course, you should briefly examine rook takes b3, c takes b3, a5, but black wins the pawn race, b2, a6, b1 equals queen. And even if it didn't win the pawn race, we could use our bishop to stop the pawn. We could even use the other bishop to stop the pawn. So plenty of options there. And the rook, of course, cannot go to d7 because the bishop controls that square. So white actually has no way to stop the c-pawn. It's over. Birdie 5 head. Yeah, rook b3 is a nice little, cute little move. Finishes the game in style. Okay, this is where our opponent should resign. Be a good boy and resign. Okay, rook a7. Well, we keep on pushing. c3, c2. Of course, we're watching the pawn, but it's nowhere near promotion, so we can just make a queen, and now we go for mate. Right now, the threshold has been crossed. We go for mate, and the easiest way to do that here is queen takes e3. Notice that move, setting up a ladder, and we use the ladder to give a check on g3, drag the king back to the first rank, and mate him on b1. The reason I'm spelling this out is because a lot of players are actually not very good at delivering that final blow. If you remember my lessons with Charlie, Moist Critical, if you don't know what I'm talking about and you're watching on YouTube, you can check it out on my channel. Charlie actually had a huge problem as a beginner with this. Everything was great. Let's give a check, by the way, and then we'll take the rook and go back for mate. Everything was great. You know, the conversion was fine. And then when he got to a situation where he had like 2 queens or a queen and a rook, he actually had a ridiculous amount of trouble actually mating his opponent. So it's always good to kind of just make sure that you have the process down. All right. So that was a straightforward game that was marred by our opponent's one-move blunder in the opening. But nonetheless, we once again faced the Bowdler attack, and we responded to it in kind of textbook fashion, just like we had previously. Now, you might remember from the previous speedrun video that we carefully considered castles and knight f6. And here, after rook e1, I was showing you this line, knight takes c4. In response to d3, I think we had planned d5. And in all of these cases, black has a nice position. Thank you for the subs, Tobias Crowd, Ledloaf, and Satanger9. Starting a hype train, damn girl. So knight c3 is really no different. I should point out, as I did during the game, that after e5, I think Nifa mentioned this, there is the very nice move d5. And a concept that should be familiar to you from the Scotch Gambit. You might say, well, I don't get it. Where should it be familiar from? The Scotch Gambit is d4, e takes d4, and bishop c4. And here, the main line goes knight f6, white plays e5, and you have the same construction. Black plays d5, right? Advancing a pawn into the center, counterattacking the bishop. Yet another opening in which this occurs is the Trompowsky. So in the Trompowsky, there is a line that I kind of play with black, which is super rare. Does anybody know, and I'll be impressed if anybody can remember the move that I tend to play here with black. This is a rare move. It's not the main move, but it's a very interesting sideline. What is it? It's not f6, no. It's not e5, not immediately. It's not g5. It's knight c6, Vince Van Scott. It is knight c6. Now, knight c6 looks absurd because you're not moving any pawns. And it looks like white's just going to go d5 and force the knight back to b8. But black is already better. Again, you have this bishop on f4. You have the knight on c6. And black's move is e5. The same concept, just the mirror image of it. And if white takes, then black takes, and black is in great shape here. And if white moves the bishop, well, he has nowhere good to move it. Because if bishop g3, we can take it, and the knight moves back to e7. By the way, a square that was carved out by the move e5. So anyways, this trick exists in many different openings, so it shouldn't come as a surprise to you. e5, d5, and if white takes the knight, we take the bishop. And what's interesting about this position is that black's pawn structure is quite damaged, but it's minus plus according to the engine. And there's a couple of factors that dictate why. First of all, black is a big lead in development. Black is the bishop pair. The pawn on c4 may seem like a liability, but it's actually a great strength. It is essentially preventing white from playing d3. It's sitting on white's position like an elephant. If white plays d3, we take on d3 and leave white with a dreadfully weak pawn that we can easily attack by playing b6 and bishop a6 if we wanted to attack it. We could also play bishop b7, aiming at the long diagonal. There is no light-scored bishop for white. We have an open g-file. You can kind of see where this is going. So just another illustration that pawn structure is not the most important factor in the vast majority of positions. Somebody asked, what if on Passant? Well, then we just take back. And again, we have a lead in development in a very nice position. And from the earlier speedrun video, you might remember that these types of positions are not very good for white because white has no easy way to push d4 and essentially liberate his pieces because of the typical trick. At the end of the line, we, of course, have the bishop h2 and queen takes queen trick, okay? So white has to restrict themselves to d3. And here, for example, we play b6 and fianchetto the bishop. And our pieces are very nicely cooperating, all of them aiming at the king side. Black is slightly better here. The regift, yeah, is not far away either. So e5 is not scary. Our opponent plays actually very decently, I thought. Bishop b5. And here there was a fork in the road. So I think we played perhaps the best move, bishop b7. But I was also pointing out that we can take on e4. And ultimately, the reason I rejected this move is because after d4, queen d1, king d1, I think I would maybe even prefer black after bishop to d7. But the problem is that after d4, white can actually start by playing bishop takes c6 and now play either d4 or knight e4. And this version of the endgame I actually like a lot less because in the endgame, the role of pawn structure becomes a lot more important, right? When the queens are off the board, you're no longer as focused on tactics. You're now focused on positional factors. And here the pawn structure is quite significant. Whereas the fact that white has lost castling rights with the queens off the board is not that significant. So d4 I don't particularly love. And instead we go bishop e7. And of course, if d4, you should remember this trick. You should remember that this wins the bishop. But white can start with the intermezzo, bishop c6, and knight back to e2. And bishop d6, yeah, is also not playable because, of course, white has e5. That's important to point out, forking the bishop and the knight. And the fact that the knight is pinned does not allow you to take on e5. Okay, so bishop e7 is fine. Knight e5 and queen to c7. So here I actually remembered from our previous analysis a very interesting line. Well, queen f3, it's a shame that our opponent did this that early. It really is. Because after bishop f4, we would have gotten into some very interesting complications. So after bishop d4, we have the move bishop to d6. And white responds by playing knight takes c6. So here a critical moment. We have a choice. The simple move is just bc, obviously, which leads to a very nice position for black. This center, it's so compact. The bishop on a4 is out of the game. We have the b file. We have the prospect at some point of pushing e5. We can even do that here and opening up the bishop. I would say the black is slightly better here. But we have another very interesting possibility, which sounds absolutely crazy. People are super afraid of discovered checks, and you shouldn't be, right? Because in many cases, discovered checks are not all that dangerous. The best move is just bishop takes bishop here. Now, it looks absurd because, first of all, white can play knight takes a7 check and win the pawn with check. But we'll get to that in a second. White has no other good checks. If white drops back and forces the king to move and then drops back, you can't stop calculating here. Black wins a piece. Black simply wins a piece by trapping this bishop b5, bishop b3, and now c4. Okay? And the same goes for any other knight retreat. White actually has to play knight a7, but now we block the check with bishop d7. And if you keep calculating, bishop takes bishop, queen takes bishop, not knight takes bishop, which allows the knight to go back with tempo. And after knight a b5, what is black's move? Well, the knights are connected, so you attack the base knight, and the line still doesn't end. White drops back to e2, counterattacking the bishop. We take the knight, black takes the bishop, but at the end of this line, what's very important is that we can take on b2. And by taking on b2, we are ruining white's queenside structure, and black is clearly better here. So crazy long line. All of this is essentially forced. Kind of a cool line if you think about it. Like all of this is forced from bishop d6. Takes here, 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 here. If the other knight goes to b5, we have the sexy move bishop b8, trapping the knight in the corner. Look at that move. Bishop f4, back to b8, trapping the knight on a7. So cool stuff. Gary asks, why not king f8? Well, then knight takes bishop. Knight takes bishop is a nice bailout option. So we actually have to remove the bishop from the knight's grasp. Takes, here, attacking the knight. Knight moves and attacks the bishop. queen takes, knight takes, queen takes, and black is slightly better. So actually, that would have been how we would have responded to bishop f4. Instead, our opponent plays queen f3, and now bishop f4, d4, nice move. Now, something I was going to point out, after knight takes e4, queen takes b2 leads to unnecessary complications. It's still winning for black, right? When I say unnecessary complications, I don't necessarily mean that it's bad, but watch this line. Knight takes f6 check, bishop f6, queen takes c6 check, and suddenly it appears that black is in quite a bit of trouble. And the engine indicates a ridiculous move in this position. It's the only winning move in this position. Everything else is a draw. Because if you move your king up, you're walking into a nasty check like this. What's the move? Yeah, bishop d7, sack both rooks, but it's temporary because we do the same thing to white. Super cool line. Queen takes a8, king 8. Now, there are no checks here. Bishop d6 doesn't do anything. So white has no choice but to take the other rook. And now it's our turn. Queen a1 and queen h1. And when the smoke clears, we are simply up a bishop. But who in their right mind would want to orchestrate these complications when we have the simple move queen to d5, which there's nothing wrong with. And in the event of a trade, the pawn protects the queen. The pawn protects the knight. The queen intercepts white's queen from attacking c6. And if white plays c4 here, well, just queen back to d7. Big deal. We walk into a pin. This pin is totally innocuous because the pawn protects the knight. So this would be a good example of managing a risk. But after d queen h5, the game is essentially over. Everything here is very straightforward. Bishop c6, bc castles e5. Nice move. Opening up the diagonal for the bishop. And after bishop e3, a little bit of surgical precision. We start with rook d8 to chase the queen away. Now we play knight g4 so that white is forced to take with a pawn. And finally, we get our bishop out to e6. Now, queen a4 was nominally more resilient. And here, I think the winning move is just rook to d2, infiltrating to the second rank. And if white gobbles up the pawn, I think we have a pretty tactic here with rook takes g2 check. This is an example of something that you can actually calculate out until the end. So it's not really unnecessary. See, here you can calculate until the end, and it's quite easy. Because if white goes to the h file, at any point you have bishop d7 takes c6. This wins the queen. This is a dangerous discovery. If king f2, then we send the other bishop forward, dragging the king back because the diagonals are controlled. And now we checkmate the king on g2. So it's all very straightforward to calculate. Here we go queen g4, and we checkmate white in the other order, bishop h4. So this would be a nice way to end the game. Okay, queen a4, rook d2, maybe white has rook f2, but then I think the simplest is just to take and get the other rook and put it on d2, and perhaps even do the same thing. So pretty straightforward lines. In the event of the queen trade, we infiltrate, we take the pawn, we play rook b8 attacking the other pawn, and the game ends after rook takes c3. Okay, JRuby7 asks, how do you know it's good / bad to let your opponent capture with their pawn and open up their rook's file? Yeah, so that's a good point, right? So there are situations where you're actually trying to take back with a pawn and open up your rook's file. And maybe the most like standard example of that is in the Italian. Let's get just like a random mainline Italian, blah, blah, blah. This is just sort of Italian, where both sides actually have this idea. And the idea that I'm talking about in the abstract is the move bishop to e3. So if you know the Italian, you will know that this structure is incredibly popular precisely because white's trying to open up the f-file for his rook. And black often does the same thing. And sometimes white says, no, 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 I'm not giving you the f-file. I'm moving my bishop back. So, of course, whether you want to allow your opponent to open up a file depends, first of all, on how much you're damaging their pawn structure as a result. Right? So that could, for example, outweigh the concession you are making, right? Because you're usually making a concession if you're allowing your opponent to open up a file. But in the case of this game, white was already down a piece. There was no pressure on f7, and so we did it without a second thought. In the Najdorf, there's a variation where white kind of makes that type of concession, but he makes it because there's a concrete follow-up idea. So watch this. Knight f3. What am I doing? A6 first, bishop to e3, e5, knight f3. And there is a variation where black plays bishop e6 and white goes knight g5. White goes after the bishop. And after bishop e7, the best move here is actually to take the knight, to take the bishop. And you might say, well, I'm giving my opponent the f-file after he castles. And that's true, but the pressure on the pawn on e6 here is so immense that it's worth giving black the f-file. Also, even if black manages to castle, which is not a given, the pawn on f2 is incredibly well protected by the bishop, and black has no other pieces on the king side. So it really is a case-by-case decision, but you should always ask yourself, okay, is it necessary to trade? And does my opponent actually have anything that they can do based on the file that opens up, right? You should try to think concretely about it. I know that's not a satisfying answer, but it is, it's a starting point. In the fantasy variation, black also accepts an open F file, and often that comes back to bite him. Thank you again to those who subscribe and keep this channel alive. I really appreciate it. Subbing to my YouTube also really helps. We will continue the grind. After vacation, I will be back in early January. So my next stream, I assume, will be January the 4th in the evening. And I will be back on the full grind. Thank you, everybody, for hanging out. Have a good New Year and Christmas. Happy holidays. And I'll see you all soon.